Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Joining me on this podcast is Royston DaCosta, who's the Assistant Treasurer of Ferguson PLC. Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. This is Craig Jeffery. I'm your host today. By way of background, artificial intelligence is certainly occupying our thoughts and conversations in an increasing measure. And I think we're all seeing the rapidly scaling capabilities across a range of activities and disciplines. We're using these tools, at least in our personal lives, if not our business lives. And in this episode, we'll discuss how AI is changing Treasury and how that change may look over time. After nearly a year break since our last joint podcast, I'm happy to welcome Royston DaCosta back to the Treasury Update podcast. Royston, it's good to have you back.
Well, thank you, Craig. As always, it's a joy to be able to not only, I know your listeners can't actually see you, but I can certainly see you. But it's great. It's really good to catch up. And as you said, time passing, it's a cliche, but it's so true. Exciting times for us in Treasury. It really is. I mean, where do we start? Where do we end? I don't think we've got enough time to go through everything that's happening in Treasury, but certainly we can cover the main points. So I'm looking forward to this session with great enthusiasm.
Royston, certainly. And, for those who may not have listened to Royston on this podcast or other podcast channels, he certainly is a well-known speaker. I guess I think of you, Royston, as a Treasury futurist. I always enjoy our prep talks and our actual podcast recording. So, maybe we could start, Royston, with what do you see happening with AI? There are certainly tools that are becoming available to almost everybody. This democratization of these AI tools, not just for the cyber elite, but for everyone. How is this democratization of tools playing out generally, and maybe as we think about it from a business or Treasury perspective?
So, Craig, look, let me start by saying I've been in Treasury for 35 years, right? So I have really come from a period and a time where I would say compared to what we have today, technology really didn't exist. In fact, even when I first joined Ferguson, which was then called Wolseley 21 years ago, we had very little technology in place in terms of no TMS, no cash pooling, no any of the 13 cloud-based solutions we have today either existed then or we were not engaged with. So, and we were just using spreadsheets like most companies were at the time. So I like also the term, and you coined it really well, democratization of AI, because from my perspective, and I don't want to be disingenuous, but I'm going to use a quote by someone pretty famous. I think we all recognize Albert Einstein. He said, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And I generally, I like to approach things from a very simplistic perspective in terms of whether it's technology, whether it's Treasury. I get there are very complex routines and theories out there. But frankly, when you're looking at technology, you've got to understand it from how's it solving your problem? Is it solving a problem for a start? I don't want a solution that's not solving a problem. And I think for me, AI, a lot of buzzwords that we use in technology, APIs and so on and so forth, didn't really seem to answer or kind of solve anything for me. I mean, it's important. I get it. And I know it's used by a lot of vendors and fintechs. So to answer your question, the democratization of AI, I think Microsoft, in terms of what they're bringing out, which is called CoPilot, is a groundbreaker in kind of bridging that gap, I think. And I think you'll see that, and probably don't realize it in some of the apps we use, they include AI. And so we're already engaged using AI. And I'm sure everyone's heard of ChatGPT, which is also becoming extremely powerful. But let me focus a bit more on what Microsoft's doing and how that's going to impact and how it's helping Treasury in particular. So one of the things that Microsoft are doing with this Copilot is they're rolling it out across all the applications. So it's like Excel, Word, PowerPoint, so on and so forth. And what you are able to do, from what I've seen so far, is you're able to use the AI technology to create effectively an automated process could be anything from, sort of how you would look for a particular email that you might want to receive an alert for on your mobile phone for, or it could also be to do with a simple process. I mean, I think most of us have some manual processes that still exist, whether it's, involving maybe something like a share buyback, where someone has to go in and enter manual payment and then request approvers to approve that payment. And there's a few bits of exchange that tend to take place there. Well, you could potentially use this solution from Microsoft to automate some of that process. In other words, an alert would come out from the system saying, okay, is a payment been entered or required here? The approvers then approve the payment and can actually generate an alert or a confirmation, for that matter, in that process to then go to that next step. So just in terms of broad overview, as I said, you've got Excel, you've got Word, you've got PowerPoint, some of the main applications I certainly use. All of these can and are being used under the Microsoft umbrella to go to that next level of automation and technology. And this doesn't require you to be a programmer. I have to emphasize that. That's so important, certainly from my perspective. I know that there are treasurers out there that have, and kudos to them for getting involved in Python and machine learning and so on and so forth. And that's great. But then there are lots of other people who are perhaps not so kind of au fait with that type of technical expertise. Whereas I think Microsoft, what they're doing, they're saying, let us do the heavy lifting for you, but give you the benefit of that. And just a caveat here, I don't have any shares in Microsoft, and I'm not particularly trying to sell, anything to the Microsoft, but I do believe their particular product is, as a lot of people and companies do use it, it's offering a lot of benefit.
As you were talking about things like rules that are enhanced with artificial intelligence, I mean, we've used workflow rules with our email. There might be auto completion. Many of us have played around with some of the robotic process automation tools that you take steps that are done very manually and you build them into a bot that will take those steps. And that was like, we have to build everything from the detail level, like you said, a programmer, whether it's use a macro, using Visual Basic or Python. Is this Microsoft CoPilot? Do you see this as it's a combination of the brains of AI supporting some of the bots or the rules and the automation? It's helping. It's like a combination. It's a combination of those things, because sometimes we think about AI as being like it can detect patterns, it can do things, but you're also bringing it into the what Microsoft's doing with this. It makes all of our jobs easier, workflows, filters, processes. What do we need to focus on?
Exactly. And I think there is a level of complexity that you can go to if you're that way inclined. And I'm sure, Microsoft will be more than happy for the users to go into that, the kind of the academy of trying to, you can go back to when macros, and they still are, frankly, can be quite complicated. I've come across people that use macros extensively and some way, have helped to automate the process to a certain degree. What we're seeing here today is a game changer in respect that the audience, I think, is wider, and it doesn't restrict or limit the use of that functionality to, sort of the level of expertise or appetite that person might have for getting into kind of writing programs. So let me give you some examples here, what Microsoft are doing in terms of CoPilot. And, one of the things about AI, and you've probably seen the ChatGPT, you go in and you can ask it a question and say, okay, how do I do this and how do I do that? Well, they've built that or integrated that into the applications. So effectively, you can take, let's say, a spreadsheet, a table of some data, and you can ask CoPilot to put together a presentation based on that data, and it does it for you. In the same kind of theme, you could also say, for example, you want to automate a process like I just described, but you're not sure how to go about doing it in terms of using the tools that they've got. And this is something on the kind of a tool they've got called Power Apps or Power Automate. And you can ask it to you can say to it, right, I want you to automate an alert to me whenever an email is sent by, say, you, Craig, to me, Royston DaCosta. And Microsoft does it for you. They create this process which says, okay, whenever an email comes through into Outlook, you will get an alert in your mobile phone that tells you Craig, or maybe CEO, or whoever it is that you want to. And that's just a very simple example. But the point being here is that AI is now playing a part in helping us to improve our workflow and to become more efficient. Because at the end of the day, I guess, as much as I'm sure there are certain processes that can't be automated, let's say, but I think a lot of the processes that have been automated through technology and some of the solutions we have, some of the internal processes we have still got a way to go. So I think the last point I'd mention on this also is quite interesting and quite powerful, I think, which is Microsoft also, and I haven't tested this fully, but my colleague at work in IT has, allows you to create your own app. So you could also then, part of that process, have an app set up on your phone. So if you're looking at internal approvals, for argument's sake, like I was describing earlier, your colleagues, your treasurer, your CFO could effectively get into that app and confirm that they've complied with a particular step of that process you've just automated. That, to me, is how much value we've got to gain from what they're doing with Microsoft.
The Royston app. I like it.
Now you give me ideas.
Yeah, that is interesting. I hadn't heard about creating your own, app to run on your mobile phone, and then, what are the security levels of that, right? Well, you're comfortable because it's yours. It's not something you picked out of the store that may or may not have been vetted. Really, really interesting. As you've talked about Power Automate and what Microsoft's doing with CoPilot, bringing that into the regular office automation tools we use, how else has this been changing and impacting our work? Also, I want you to describe that, I guess, more from a future perspective. What does this mean for the work we do? What will that mean for the workforce? Because one of the things, just as some additional background for you to mull on, is we're talking about Treasury people. We need more people with technology skills in Treasury, not just deep Treasury experience, but those who are particularly adept at the tech, because it's changing so rapidly. We need to bring those to bear. Is this going to require more of that or require less of that because it's more available to everybody? So how is work going to change?
Now, you're absolutely right. There's a number of dimensions to this question, frankly, Craig, because my views, and this is not just my views, this is some of the statistics that I've been sharing with you separately around the demographics and the future for the workforce in the world, frankly, rather than just in the UK and the West. But I think from a Treasury perspective, there's an element for sure that as we age and more people begin to retire and leave the workforce, there's, I think, a huge risk, frankly, that we're going to have a shortage. And I think we're already beginning to experience some of that, not just in Treasury, but in our workforce generally. It's very widely known that, this generation, Gen Z, are not reproducing. And this is not just here in the UK, I say it's globally, or I say globally, correction, it's in most of the West, because there's certainly continent of Africa is bucking that trend, but they're not reproducing as much as we did, our generation or previous generations. And so technology will help for sure in mitigating some of that, but it by no means will address the full shortfall. And so I think governments are already looking at, and thinking the US is particularly, and certainly UK governments are looking into how to try and attract people that retired back into the workforce, just like the Japanese economy did very successfully, by the way. So there's an element of that I think needs to be considered as much as other aspects. And we don't want to get into the political side here, but potentially migration, I imagine, and sort of look at training up new sort of new entrants and trying to attract, frankly, the next generation into Treasury and into the sort of this particular part of our industry. But for sure, the people that come into Treasury nowadays recognize that you have to have an openness and some level of knowledge about technology. I think the important point I would always bring and try and sort of encourage people, even those that are currently in Treasury, is be open to the potential solutions out there, like I've just introduced in terms of CoPilot, because it's so important that if you don't kind of look at what's going on around you, the chances are you're going to miss it and you could be left behind. And that's not just as individuals or as treasury teams, but that could be as a company as well. And that's disastrous for any company. I'm sure you'd agree. So the degree to what one should then start thinking about these sort of these initiatives and these solutions and technologies, no one's got enough time to look at everything that's out there. But I would say, whenever you hear about something like I've heard about CoPilot, when I heard about the API aggregator, those are sort of initiatives you should not ignore, because I always try and look for those initiatives that are going to add value, that are going to make a difference, not just in terms of treasury, but to the environment I work in and obviously to my company. And if it's going to add value, then why wouldn't I want to look at that? So I feel like this generation, the Gen Zs, and obviously now Gen Alpha will be coming in soon for those born from 2002 onwards, they have pretty much grown up only knowing technology. They've only been used to, the smartphone, the digital age, and obviously you think of a Gen Alpha growing up with AI. So that bar will only go upwards in a good way, frankly, in a very good way, because it means hopefully that from a treasury perspective, those processes that we may have accepted for decades in some ways will be questioned. And they're asking the question is, why should we be doing these manual, kind of almost inefficient tasks when you can do them in a more automated, more efficient way? My daughter's Gen Z, and occasionally I kind of get in, looking at my presentations, and she'll say to me, well, you can do this. Now, I thought I'm not saying I know it all, for sure I don't, but it's interesting that they have that mindset that they've grown up, and she's obviously gone to university and she studied. So they've been, sort of trained as well to recognize the quickest, easiest, most efficient way to get to your goal. Now, the byproduct of that could well be, and this is not part of this conversation, but it is important, is this whole aspect of, having a balanced work life, which is also kind of a byproduct of the pandemic. But it's a good thing. It's a positive thing, because it means that hopefully this generation and the future generations will have a more kind of productive and enjoyable life in terms of being able to balance their work and social life in a great way, I think, much better way than any of us, or certainly I have in my time.
That's great, Royston. And I don't know that the Gen Z says, why should I? I think they say, I'm not going to do that manual task. They may not even, they say that in their head, and then they go down the road and they're like, I saved 2 hours of manual nonsense, and I'm doing stuff better for my same exact concept. Just funny how they present it.
No, you're absolutely right. And just on that point, actually, there's something else. And again, I know this is not necessarily part of this discussion, but it's some of the statistics I see where Gen Z, they come into a job and they see that it's not meeting up to their level of expectations. They will walk. There's no hesitation. They don't have the same, let's say, inhibitions that maybe our generations had, where, you kind of like job hop or whatever. No, from their perspective, it's there's an expectation, as I say, the whole hybrid working and just the sort of engagement in technology. But I think there's an aspiration behind that, frankly, which is, if you can work for a company that does things better, that uses the tools and the technologies that are out there in a more kind of productive, efficient way, how can it be a bad thing? I just don't see it. I can't agree with them.
As you said, you could be left behind, or you will be left behind if you're not doing that. And then, from an individual perspective, you will certainly suffer from that, I think. And you may be left behind. You may become obsolete in your lack of current skills, right? But certainly the companies, if you're not advancing on the technology side to make things continually improve, your company will be left behind. Certainly Treasury will. And so you're requiring other areas to make up for that, as opposed to, like you said, how can I make things better? Really important mindset. And how it's changed over time. Autocomplete, right? When we saw that, like, we can laugh at our phones. It's like, I didn't mean to say that. That's not what I meant. It was foolish. But we're finding that in our emails or other systems, it oftentimes completes a sentence that's pretty good. And so you just hit, I can't even remember what you hit, if you hit enter tab, and you're like, I'll take that language. probably another topic. Every generation complains about the next generation. It's like, oh, you didn't learn cursive. And I'm like, why is that useful? It's like I don't see that's a need to learn cursive. And I'm sure I've gotten people upset by that. And same thing with it was like using a calculator and being able to use a 10 key where you could type and enter numbers quickly. That's not necessarily a needed skill now. It certainly teaches you. Maybe we could talk sometime in the future about, will AI make it so that we stop thinking? The process of writing or coming up with arguments or dialogue is really crucial to order our thoughts. And if we just say, write a paper for me, you get the generic flow and variability from like ChatGPT, but you're not ordering your thoughts and thinking right. And so that seems to me to be a bigger potential shortfall, because that's our thoughts as opposed to my skill with my hand in writing cursive.
No, all of that's actually correct, Craig. And it's an interesting area that you've opened up there, because I think what I've kind of tried to encapsulate is really kind of, let's say, using that analogy of a stream that looks for the fastest way to its exit, or to its goal, if you like. And I think this is where I see technology now, at least in terms of Treasury, dare I say, not the only department, probably one of the departments that have been neglected in many ways for years from advancing technology. And I think that's got a direct link with the banks, frankly, because the banks have not really invested as much as they should have done, but they are beginning to now in technology. And so that's good. But I would say, so there's an element now where we're trying to kind of get to that kind of place where, certainly with, whether it's payments or TMSs or some of the solutions we use, they've automated those processes. But when you look beneath that hood, like you just described, and you think about, and this is something I always kind of highlight a lot, particularly when you think of cyber security, it's so important to have that understanding of how those processes work and what you have in place, and some of the transactions that we use in Treasury. So you can never lose sight of, the theory behind those transactions. So that goes without saying. So like you said, in terms of the calculator, that's an interesting example, because I guess you're right. This generation probably don't use calculators, and everything kind of pretty much, why would they in their mind need to use one if it's presented to them? Just as much as we probably don't think twice about using a search engine to do most of our planning, if it's for going on holiday, whatever. Why would you want to go back to the days where you had to pick up a phone or use some sort of directory of some sort to research which company? I'm not sure they even produce those anymore. My point being is that as times change and the tools and life that we lead in society progresses to this extent, even if you think of your personal banking arrangement, no, I don't think, I'm so used to using my phone and, so my online banking to do all of my requirements. Who goes into a bank branch anymore to do their banking? There was a time when that's the only way you could. Again, the point being is there comes a point in time where these kind of processes, if you like, become redundant almost. I mean, they're still required for certain things. Don't get me wrong. We don't get rid of branches altogether, but they're reduced significantly. I think it's important that we use them as appropriate. But it's also important that as a result of what we're now being able to achieve through being more efficient, we can begin to focus more on being, I think, a lot more strategic. I think that's the game changer for Treasury looking forward. And actually, it's a funny thing that I kind of recollect someone asking me a question, the age-old question. This was about probably 4 or 5 years ago, pre-pandemic. What did I think the Treasury function would look like in 10 years' time? And I'm not trying to blow my own trumpet here, Craig, but I, at the time, really believed that Treasury would be much more remote. Not in the way it is today. I didn't see that fully, but I did see kind of technology kind of, sort of infiltrating the whole office workspace, as well as, our kind of working lives, and much more online in terms of how we engaged. And from that perspective, it made me then also think that means we can begin to focus a lot more on those challenges that sometimes we don't have the time to delve into enough depth. Plus, with the technology that's now becoming more available, it's quantum technology or AI or some of the other technologies that are coming up, this will then give us, let's say, some competitive advantage if you're looking to see, how can we make things better, not only for our companies, but in terms of how we're competing out there in the world, in terms of our competitors. How do we ensure that we're hedging exposures a lot more closer to 100% than at the moment? Perhaps it's not possible to do that. These are some of the areas, and obviously trying to kind of, I won't say predict, but forecast for that inevitable next crisis that unfortunately will occur at some point. How do we make sure we're suitably prepared for that? These are sort of not just lessons learned, but important life lessons, I think, that not just Treasury, but certainly Treasury should be kind of focusing on it, using the technology that's become available and will only continue to become stronger to equip us to be able to navigate our companies through these uncharted waters that keep coming up.
Yeah, excellent, Royston. As we come to the final thoughts section, I want to hear your final thoughts, but I want to position it perhaps a little differently than we had considered as we just talked through some of these points. One of the most over talked about but useful diagrams is a regular triangle and then an inverted triangle. And it was like, we want to move from this to that. And the top part of the triangle was strategic and the bottom part was all operational tasks. And then you want to move to the inverted triangle where you're spending more time on the strategic activities and very, very little on the mundane. And that certainly is the case. But I guess, is AI going to be the end of the analyst level? Because that's going to be mostly taken out or partially taken out, or is that going to make more powerful analysts? And is this the first true opportunity to allow for strategic thinking that we've talked about for, like you said, you've been in Treasury for 35 years. It's been talked about for that entire time, or is it something else?
Okay, I think on the analyst bit, frankly, I don't think it's quite as straightforward as that. To me, what AI is doing is going back to the original point about democratization. It's opening the whole aspect or kind of quality of analysis to everyone. We're all effectively going to have to be open to being analysts, because the nature of AI is that it's offering you a benefit or solution that to some degree you're going to need to be able to analyze and be able to interact with it to a certain degree to be able to utilize it fully. I guess where I really want to go here, Craig, is this question about, and it keeps coming up, and I don't think it's going to go away, which is, will technology make us all redundant? And I think we all know that's not going to be the case. It does have an impact for sure on certain types of roles. And if you look at industries, they can, there's certain obvious industries, particularly in manufacturing, where that's true. But even then, I would say it's not an elimination of role. In some cases, it's just a displacement. It's sort of transposing or transferring skills from that particular role or that sector to another sector. I mean, in terms of IT, when I first looked at cloud-based solutions, there was a bit of kind of hesitancy about what that meant for those roles. People felt thinking, oh gosh, we're going to be, no. Actually, what happened, a lot of the IT people are looking after is began to start looking after SFTP and, secure file transfer protocol and, sort of supporting us in terms of some of the cloud-based solutions. And of course, now you've got cybersecurity. So I don't think it's necessarily one or the other. So coming on to the analyst bit, I think we are all called upon to become more analytical in our roles. So it just means that it'll be a wider pool, if you like. For the strategic part, goes without saying, it would be really pointless, I think, from a kind of looking ahead, if we're engaging all this technology and we've got this data, and then we sit around just twiddling our thumbs. I mean, that wouldn't make a lot of sense, and certainly not my kind of forte. But I would definitely say, we are all called upon. I remember coming across treasurer, I think, one of the UK car manufacturers. And I was very inspired by what he was saying then. This is going back a few years. He said he encouraged his team to build in 20% of their objectives every year to looking at innovative solutions. Now, for me, that's part and parcel of trying to be strategic as well. You've got to not just think about what you can do within your own role, within your own team, in your own company, but also what other people doing outside you. How can you use or perhaps gain from that, and sort of try and see whether you can implement some efficiencies in your. So I think you've got to be more outward looking as well. And the technology we have today, apart from the AI and the machine learning, you've got sort of webinars, Zoom calls, you've got sort of podcasts like these. I mean, absolutely utilize all these mediums to try and enrich your life so that you can bring more value to your company. It's an interesting point you bring up. I hadn't really considered this, but I think it is an important point. One of my favorite technologies that hasn't really hit full on, the Treasury anyway, the Metaverse. So here we've got an interesting rising technology. I mean, it's already out there, don't get me wrong, but we're not using it extensively. Microsoft Teams actually has included already, if you looked at seen the option in there, it's got an immersive option which you can use to basically create an avatar for yourself in a meeting. So I could become now, if I want to do, but on this call, but an avatar, and you could do the same. Bit crude at the moment because I don't see where that particular value is. But in time, that will become a holographic image, so you can actually be in the same room as the other person. A lot more interesting experience there. But of course, alongside that, you've then got the other kind of negative aspect of all this technology, which is, identity fraud. So, but I do believe strongly, look, with every technology that comes out that's got a lot of good in it, there's going to be that, would you say, nefarious activity that goes with it. But this should not stop us from still trying to progress. And I believe that companies like Microsoft and Amazon and the Googles as well are investing enough in security to ensure that there's a level of protection we can still rely on. So absolutely, we should embrace this, but always be cautious.
Thank you so much, Royston.
Thank you, Craig. Much enjoy that.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.